There we go. Dr. Chike Akua, I don't know, this is double mic, double management process, but we are glad to be here. We want to thank Daniel Marbonu for allowing us to be able to have this platform to have a discussion about Pan-African leadership. Daniel is a part of the leadership of the United States of Africa, prolific leader in Kenya. And so this platform is actually initiated by him. And so right now, we want everybody to know that we are indeed global. This is not just simply a thing in the U.S. or in Kenya or in Tanzania, or any other place. We are all over. And Dr. Chike Akua, you are here. And I want you to know that, as you always know, that your voice is global. And I am honored that you have chosen to be here on this day for the Pan-African Leadership series. This idea of leadership, Pan-African leadership, is about understanding how to unpack notions of Afrocentric or African-centered cosmology, axiology, epistemology, and ontology. How do we think? How do we function? How do we be? And so in thinking about this, you came to mind because you are one that's on the forefront of engaging in elevating Afrocentric or Afrocentric education. So anyway, we wanted you to be able to just open up and share with us about your identity. How did you become Chike Akua? How did you become an educator of the year, and one who still now writes and advances the idea of human transformation through education? So, Dr. Chike Akua, your introduction. Talk to the world about what's going on.
All right. Thank you for having me on today, brother. Just a little bit about my background. I'm the son. I'm the last child of five, the son of two wonderful warriors who came about, I would say, post-civil rights movement in the United States. And so I grew up in a culture in a family that was rich in culture and love. And my parents came up through a very strong Black tradition. My mother graduated from Howard University School of Nursing. My father went to Meharry Medical School to earn his Doctor of Dental Surgery degree. And so we grew up in a community of Black professionals largely. And as the youngest of five children, I was, well taken care of and so forth. But I went through some educational challenges. And the educational challenges that I went through, particularly in high school, is what inspired me to become a teacher. Now, before my father went to medical school, he was an award-winning science teacher himself. So I guess you might say that teaching is in my genes. But when I went through my challenges in high school as a struggling student, it occurred to me that there were others out there that were like me. And it made me want to go back and reach those that I would refer to today as the last, the lost, the least, and left behind. Also, when I got into college, I was exposed to a number of Afrocentric scholars, including the works of Dr. Carter G. Woodson, Molefi Asante, Dr. Naeem Akbar, Tony Browder, Asa Hilliard, and others. And that information transformed my life at a time when I was kind of rising up out of this fog of academic underachievement myself. And so it made me want to become a teacher to reach students who had been just like me, who had almost fallen through the cracks. The difference with me is that typically there's either a family safety net or a community safety net that can catch our children when they go astray or when they're not performing at the level that we know that they can. Well, in my case, I fell into a family safety net. My sister and my brothers were able to help me to get back on track. But that made me think, what about the young brothers and sisters that don't have a strong family safety net or don't have a strong community safety net to fall into? And so that's what inspired me to go into education. When I heard and read some of the works of Jawanza Kunjufu and Asa Hilliard and Naeem Akbar, Malefi Asante, and other Afrocentric educators and scholars, it helped me to see that the way that we were being taught was incorrect, and the content of what we were being taught is incorrect. And that was one of the reasons why so many of us were struggling in education, that we were really receiving a colonial education, a Eurocentric education that did not meet our needs. And so that's a little bit of the background that has inspired me to not only become an educator, but also to produce African-centered or Afrocentric curriculum content and online programs as well.
Thank you, brother. When you shared this this idea of academic underachievement in the context of a family of educators, it speaks volumes to how a system of education can miss an entire population. That it does not necessarily mean that you can come that you because you come from a family of means doesn't mean that you cannot be malnourished in a system and become disassociated from that system. Right.
Exactly.
And so you have people who are educators, and so they knew the value of education, but there was an anemia within education, and you saw that as well. And so you then, as we talk about often, studied the works of Jawanza Kunjufu, Naeem Akbar, Asa Hilliard, and I know that Dr. Hilliard, Baba Asa is one of your jegnas, your real for real jegnas. You roll with them hard. This idea of the last, the least, and the left behind, that even coming from a family of means, one can still suffer that. Agbu talks about this work, about coming from means and at the same time still being disconnected. But you saw there was something essential to stemming the tide of anemia, that is fortifying education with content that elevates consciousness, and more importantly, that transforms the soul to be powerful. And so talk about that, the idea of Afrocentric, and then I want you to share with us the notion of Seba, and then we're going to segue into identity restoration. So your life, transformation, African-centered thought, education, Seba, and the notion of identity restoration.
Sure. Let me start with a definition of Afrocentric education or African-centered education. I tend to use those terms interchangeably, but I want to start with that definition because I don't want to assume that we're operating from the same definition. There are many misconceptions about what African-centered education is. After a thorough review of the research literature, I have defined African-centered education as centering ourselves and our children in the best of African culture to examine and analyze information, meet needs, and solve problems. Now I'm going to break this definition down one more time. Centering ourselves and our children. First, we have to center ourselves in the best of African culture before we can expect our children to be centered, because oftentimes we're decentered and dislocated from our place of power. So centering ourselves and our children in the best of African culture at a time when many of our children have only been exposed not to the best of the culture, but to the worst of the culture. So African-centered education is centering ourselves and our children in the best of African culture to do three things: to examine and analyze information, meet needs, and solve problems. If we're not meeting needs and solving problems, then it's an exercise in futility. It's all vanity. So it's good for us to know about our history and our culture, but if our knowledge of history and culture doesn't allow us to teach us how to meet needs and solve problems in our communities, then it's all for naught. As a matter of fact, the way Amos Wilson says it, Dr. Amos Wilson says, if our study of Black history is just a study for us to feel good about ourselves, then we'll just die feeling good. And what he meant by that is that there are certain things that we must do for ourselves that nobody else can do for us. So simply memorizing names and dates from our history is insufficient to meet those needs. We have to have skills to provide what is needed for our families our communities, and our nations. So again, African-centered education is centering ourselves and our children in the best of African culture to examine and analyze information, to meet needs and solve problems in African communities. Right now, in most systems of miseducation, we're taught to meet needs and solve problems for other people, not for us. We're taught how to make money for other people, not us. We're taught how to do other people's bidding and come under their direction and leadership, not our own. So African-centered education is a quest for agency and a quest for sovereignty. And that's a far cry. That's very, very different from many of the colonial education models that we have come up in, whether we're in the United States, whether we're in Kenya, whether we're in Ghana, whether we're in Senegal. We know that colonial regime of European colonization, whether it was from the British, whether it was from the French, whether it was from the Portuguese, we know that those systems of miseducation have been placed all over the African continent and all over the world. And though many African nations gained their independence starting in the 60s, they're still trying to throw off the yoke of colonial miseducation even to this day. So you asked me to speak about African-centered education, and I think the next concept was SEBA.
Yes, but hold on, pause, because that was rich, right? So we're gonna hit SEBA, but the idea of decentered notions of beingness and the idea of centering in the best of what it means to be African. Oftentimes people think that to be African-centered means to be anti someone else, but it actually means to be pro-African, pro-self. And at that point, I can have an appreciation for someone else. And so that is imperative for people to understand that to have an educational system that is centered in the best of what it means to be who we are is essential, because we do become decentered in alien constructs of education. And that's why we're going to talk about SEBA, an idea of a doucere to bring out that which is there. You said to analyze problems, to meet needs, and to, analyze situations or material content to meet needs and to solve problems. That if we're not doing that, then actually we are engaging in some idea of annihilation or abnegation of our true duty to be able to ascend and be rising and setting suns, as Dr. Fukuyama says. You said that we should talk about the issue of having more agency, and the notion education should give us also sovereignty. I like this idea of a sovereign nation, that when a nation is sovereign, it knows exactly what it is and so how it functions. And so we have to be sovereign to be able to have this element of liberation, freedom, and exploration of self to move into higher levels. And you mentioned the system of miseducation. I want people to catch this, the system of miseducation. It is a system of miseducation for Africans, that is so that we can be in servitude. This is what Dr. Chike Akua said, we'll be in servitude of others. And so we learn how to serve others, but not how to serve the interest of African people. That is powerful. Go ahead, comment.
If you don't mind, let me add to that, because Dr. Mwali Mushuja teaches us the difference between schooling and education. And he tells us that schooling is for the purpose of reproducing current power relations. Very different from education. Education teaches you how to meet needs and solve problems, but schooling is for the purpose of reproducing current power relations. So if there's a certain percentage of the Black population that is caught up in the prison industrial complex, then the purpose of schooling is to reproduce that reality. If there's a certain percentage of us who don't graduate from high school or are not able to go on to advanced training in college, then the purpose of schooling is to reproduce that reality. If there's a certain percentage of us that are unemployed or underemployed, then the purpose of schooling is to reproduce that reality. If we are economically exploited and politically inactive or politically not organized, then the purpose of schooling is to reproduce that reality. So that's very different from what education is, and what we find ourselves in is in systems of miseducation and systems of schooling. Schooling and education are very, very different, and we have to be very, very clear about the difference.
So Dr. Shooter talked about, indeed, as you said, schooling and education, how we become trained, but not necessarily enlightened and informed about who we are as a people, as a person. And we learn then to serve the needs of others, of our oppressor, because the educational system is designed for that. Even Dr. Woodson talked about the miseducation of the Negro, says that the Negro in the ghetto looks to the oppressor to get him out of the ghetto. He never got out of the ghetto. But also he said that when you control a man's thinking, you do not worry about his actions. You tell him to come here, to go there. He will find his place and he will stay in it. And in fact, if there is no back door, after saying that he goes to the back door without being told, if there is no back door, he will make one for his own benefit. His education makes it necessary. So this is what we talk about, right? This idea of education and training, and you've been informed by some of the greatest minds in this area. I'm even been impacted by the work of Kwame Baba Ajay Akoto at the Nation House, and having my children immersed in that environment. So those brothers carved out spaces for children to be sovereign in their thinking. And so the education is about informing one of who they are. So we know that the word education comes from the Latin concept of educe, to bring out, education, the process of, to bring out the higher potential. We know that if you ground the conversation education in African-centered thought, it suggests that the higher potential is within, that man is a microcosm of the macrocosm, that the divine is within. And so when we engage in proper education, we simply bring out that which is there. That leads us to the ancient Kemetic concept of SBA, Seba, and you talk about this quite often. We know Dr. Baba Asa brought this to my attention years ago, and this is a part of what you talk about. So share with us about Seba, what the symbol or construct means, and how does it inform true African-centered education?
Yes, sir. And you mentioned Baba Kwame Ajay Akoto, and one of the things that he mentions as I talk about Seba, he said, education is the reproductive system of a people. So I always ask my graduate students, my master's and doctoral level students in education leadership, I ask them, what are we trying to reproduce? If education is the reproductive system of a people, what are we trying to reproduce? And we don't want to reproduce those that cannot meet needs and solve problems. So when you look at this ancient Kemetic or Egyptian concept of Seba, Seba is the oldest word in human history relative to teaching and learning. It has three primary meanings: teach, door, and star. And this, along with other research information, tells us that the ancient African philosophy of education is that the teacher opens the door to the universe so that the student may shine like a star. Okay? And this is critical because that gives us our mission statement. But you won't find that as a mission statement in any of the public school systems in America, and probably not in other places around the world, unless they have adopted an African-centered outlook. So again, this word Seba refers to the master teacher. It also refers to the student, depending on the construction of the word. If I were to show it to you in the original Medu Neter language that people call hieroglyphics today, there is an iteration of it where it means student, and there's an iteration where it means master teacher. Then when you take the word Sebait, that's the wisdom teaching. So Seba is the master teacher. Sebait is the wisdom teaching, the body of literature and insight that they teach from. Okay? This is, again, very different than how most teachers are trained. Also in traditional African education, if we were to borrow once again from Baba Fukiao, who you mentioned earlier, he tells us that every child is a rising sun and a radiating center of light. Every child is a rising sun and a radiating center of light. If we use that metaphor of a rising sun, then that means that they have a solar system around them. So education is really about teaching a child how to build a community around themselves, a functional community that is centered and grounded in the best of who we are to serve ourselves, our families, our communities, and indeed the world. So these African-centered concepts are so very important, and we don't typically learn those concepts when we go to schools that are built on Eurocentric principles.
So what we do learn, right, and teachers learn about those children are bad. They are hyperactive,
Right.
ADHD, right? We get all of that. So we get these negatives, but centering our thought says that, as you said, Dr. Fukuyama Baba said that rising and setting suns, the idea of illumination, that children are going through kala, zima, kala, the idea of awakening and then being extinguished and awakening again. It seems that we learn in general that we are to extinguish the light within children, that we are supposed to guide them into a way of proselytize them into a way of functioning that serves something else other than the idea of the higher notion of self. Speak to that, because that really has informed a lot of your work. And also, we want to talk about the books that you've written that's designed to inspire higher thinking.
Sure. So to extend that metaphor even further, when you talk about illuminate light and illumination, so Baba Fukuyama says every child is a rising sun and a radiating center of light. Unfortunately, in many circles, educators talk about what's wrong with our children rather than what's right. When you talk about light and illumination, another ancient Kemetic concept that goes hand in hand with Seba would be that of the Sakusheti. The Sakusheti is the one who is able to illuminate the light within themselves and others. One who is able to illuminate the light within themselves and, more importantly, illuminate the light within others. Now, this is a critical distinction as opposed to those that extinguish the light in our children, as you said, because systems of schooling and miseducation are designed to extinguish the light rather than to illuminate the light within our children. So our children are seen in so many schools, they're seen as a problem rather than as people. So part of the work that I do and the team of teacher transformation specialists that I work with, what we do is we teach teachers how to bring out the brilliance within our children and to see them as brilliant, to see them as genius, and to call that forth. And we see them as people rather than as a problem.
To bring forth that light, right? To see the potential. We know that when a child, or when we are conceived within the womb, it is suggested by scientists that when the sperm meets the egg, there is a light that shines. So we come into being with this spark of light. And there are things and systems that can actually diminish that light or harness it for their own benefit, for their own shine. And so we see this happening quite often, where Western society takes the genius of African people and then suggests to it that it's not really valuable, but as it expresses itself in the universe, they begin to profiteer off of the genius. We can see that occurring in the form of course, rap and or hip hop music. We see it in how people are able to use rhythmistic expressions on the basketball court or the football field. We hear it in orature, in writing. And so we see that this is a part of the prolific African genius, but it has been harnessed by the oppressor for their own benefit, and at the same time being told that it has no real value. I can recall, Brother Chike, when we were early on playing drums, and I played I was on both sides of the city of Shreveport, Louisiana, a white side and the black side. That many times we would play cadences. I'd play cadences with the white guys, and they would talk about the cadences that were played by the black schools, and they would talk about the jungle rhythm and so forth and so on. And later, when I got to Grambling, we were marching on we were told by the Japanese government that they wanted us, both bands, USC, University of Southern California, and Grambling, to march across the field on to the cadence of Grambling State University, and USC became insulted and said that we can't march to that nigga beat. Well, almost became an altercation out there because
Wow.
this idea of not being able to understand the rhythmicity or not wanting to appreciate it until they could figure out how to harness some of that. Now you fast forward from that period of time, you go 10, 15, 20 years later when they figured out some of the elements of it, and then they start talking about drumline. And so now they do some of the same things that we call nigga beats, but they had to figure out how to use it and harness it for their own benefit. The problem is that they haven't mastered it in totality because it's more than simply technique. It's also feel, affect. It comes from a different essence. But the point is that they've learned some elements to master it, and they call it drumline. If you understand the real notion of drumming, it is not linear, and we understand that African reality is not linear, but it is a circular process. That's why you're playing on a circular item called a drum that engages in a conversation that is circular, that creates the entire rhythmicity, which is the same thing that happens when we talk about vibration, rhythm, and flow in the classroom. That's why how call response work is that it is rhythm, it is synchronicity that occurs between student and teacher that is circular. And that's often why they can't master that as well, because it is tied to rhythm, vibration, and flow, and they're still trying to work on it. But you have been one who's taken the constructs of our ancient African ancestors, our contemporary scholars, and you said that if someone brings you a student, you will create a scholar, and you make them a scholar. And go ahead.
I also like to say, those who think our children can't be reached have never seen a master teacher teach. So I've literally taken students who were failing and brought them to an A level, transformed their consciousness and transformed their grades. I don't view that as something so special about me, more so the methods that I've been taught to use. So again, those that think our children can't be reached have never seen a master teacher teach. When you talked about the power of the drum, one of the things that I like to use when I was a middle school teacher, I was teaching 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. We used to drum before class. We used to drum before the school day, as a matter of fact, and it required myself and a couple of other brothers to get up early and get to school early. But we would be positioned in the bus lane, and we would be drumming as the students were coming in. And then, interestingly enough, when we started doing that, now we didn't ask permission to do this or anything like that. We just decided to do it, a self-conscious act of self-determination. And the parents loved it. Like if we missed a day, they were like, where are the brothers who are drumming? Then some of the sister teachers would come out and they would dance while we were drumming as the students were walking in. And it created a certain type of ancestral spiritual energy that was so powerful in the building and around the building. So that's just a very simple example of some of the things that can be done to center ourselves in the best of our history and culture, sending out those vibrations to make a student ready to learn. But again, I go back to this notion of how people have stigmatized our children and see them more as a problem rather than as people. And once again, I say, those who think our children can't be reached have never seen a master teacher teach. I've seen children under the direction of one teacher. The teacher tries to tell them to do something and they're resistant to it. They don't do it. They may even fuss back at the teacher very disrespectfully. You can take that same group of students, put them in the presence of a master teacher who tells them to do something. Pull your pants up, or take your hood off, or take your hat off, or get involved in the class and so forth. And the students respond to that. You can take the same group of students that were bouncing off the walls, unattentive, disrespectful, but under the guidance of a master teacher, they are attentive, they're respectful, they're answering questions, they're asking questions, they're totally immersed and totally engaged in the lesson, because master teachers know how to bring out the brilliance within our children.
A master teacher can reach that spaces that others can find out how to teach. That is powerful, brother. That the passage, the statement is on point, because we have to understand, what does it mean to be Sebai? What does it mean to be a master teacher? A Shetit is one who studies deeply, right? The knowledge of a people have to engage in their own self-knowledge, own self-study, because until that self-study occurs, that self-analysis, self-assessment, one has nothing to deliver to anyone else. What was your self-study like? How did you get to a point where you began to be able to share this, to become a master teacher? Because you had to have some experiences that led you to be able to start to lead, to become one who self-develops, because there was no accolades, there were no scholarships thrown towards developing a firm. This is self-gratifying, self-motivated process. It's not something that people just really sit around and applaud very much.
Right. Well, I had to be very intentional about that, because, as you said, there were no scholarships or things of that nature at the time. But I came about at a time in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, in the midst of the Afrocentric or African-centered education movement, when it was starting to become more widely diffused, more widely spread. And so that's how I came into the knowledge of a lot of the African-centered scholars. I also went through a traditional African rite of passage when I was a student at Hampton University through the Brotherhood of Kemet Nu. And that was where I was first exposed to Afrocentric thought. We had to learn the Nguzo Saba, the 7 principles of Kwanzaa. We had to learn certain African-centered principles and live by them and support brothers in the process. So that was the first level and the first layer. That was my first initiation, okay? So that occurred around 1990, 1991. 10 years later, after becoming a teacher and using a lot of that information that I learned as part of my rites of passage, 10 years later, I was fortunate and blessed to go through my second initiation, and that was through Dr. Asa Hilliard and the Jegna Collective. So that was a group of African scholars and practitioners who came together to teach us the truth about who we are and what it means to operate in this tradition of being a Jegna, a master teacher, or a Seba, a master teacher. And then I would say my third initiation came as a doctoral student under Nana Dr. Joyce King. Of course, she was a close colleague of Dr. Asa Hilliard, and Dr. Hilliard passed in 2007. I had wanted to study under him in my doctoral studies, but he passed before I had the opportunity to do that. But I was blessed to be under his tutelage, during the Jegna Collective for 2 or 3 years. But then I went on, and Baba Asa made his transition in 2007. I started my doctoral studies under Dr. Joyce King in 2008. And I studied under her for 8.5 years and was further immersed in Afrocentric and African-centered concepts and ideas. So it's been a long but very fulfilling journey to learn that we are carrying on a legacy that is literally thousands of years old, that there is a small cadre, and you're certainly a part of that, brother, in the wonderful work that you do as an African psychologist and educator, that there's relatively a small cadre of African educators who have sought to carry on this legacy, the keepers of the culture, if you will, knowledge keepers. And so we wear that with great pride, but it is also a struggle, and one that one must be prepared for. As a matter of fact, the first criteria to be a Jegna or master teacher is to be tested in battle. And we will be tested. We know that we are constantly tested, but that's just the first of 7 criteria of being a Jegna.
While you're there, go ahead and unpack those. We'll go back to a question or two. So that is first of 7 of a Jegna, to be tested in battle. The next one is what? Unpack these for us.
So there's 7 of those. The first is to be tested in battle, because when you have an ideology that is about empowering us as a people and teaching us to meet needs and solve problems at a time where there are those that want to keep us disempowered and unable to meet our needs and solve problems, you're going to come up against opposition. You're going to be tested and struggle and battle. So that's the first one. The second one is that a Jegna or master teacher demonstrates extraordinary and unusual fearlessness. And this is important because, again, when you come up against the forces and factors in society that want to keep us dumb, deaf, blind, and disempowered, then you have to show extraordinary and unusual fearlessness because your livelihood and your life may be on the line. Your ability to provide for your family may be compromised. And this is why it's so important that we understand how to meet needs and solve problems and raise capital at the same time, raise capital and consciousness. So the third thing is that a Jegna shows determination and courage in protecting his or her people, land, and culture. Meaning you can always depend on a Jegna to step up and to speak up, especially in the context of when and where lies are being told. So they show determination and courage. Then number 4, they show diligence and dedication to our people. So you will always see them working for the advancement of our people. They don't always have to necessarily be out front, although sometimes they are, but they're working behind the scenes, mobilizing, organizing, building, constructing, producing, okay? The other thing is another quality of the Jegna, the 5th quality, is that they produce an exceptionally high quality of work. That when they set out to do something, it is marked by high quality, is marked by excellence. That is whether they're teaching, whether they're organizing, whether they're writing a book, whether they're writing an article, whether they're organizing a conference, whatever they happen to do, whether they're teaching a group of children, it's marked by exceptionally high quality work. The 6th thing is that they're dedicated to the protection, defense, nurturance, and development of our young by advancing our people and our culture. Okay, they're dedicated. You will see them involved in consistent action. You will see them today, but then if you go back 5 years, they were involved in this work. You go back 10 years, they were involved in this work. If you go forward 10, 20 years, you will find them still doing this work because they are consistent in what they do. The 7th characteristic of a Jegna is that they're deeply spiritual people. They're spiritually centered. They're connected to the ancestors and the Most High because they regard what they do as their purpose and mission for being on the planet. So those are the 7 characteristics of a Jegna, and that information was brought to us by Dr. Asa Hilliard and Dr. Charles Finch. Of course, the term Jegna comes from the Amharic word out of Ethiopia, and it encapsulates what we should be training and teaching all of our teachers to do and be.
You mentioned Dr. Charles Finch. I mean, you're unloading all of the major Jegnas that have brought forth and kept alive the African thought, the African way of being in a space where people begin to suggest that this was suspect. You often, I know that you studied Dr. John Henry Clark, and we know about Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, and all these individuals that brought this information forward to inform us of who we are. You said something about rites of passage, and as you go through these 7 aspects, 7 values or principles of a Jegna, this is a part of a rites of passage. You often talk about how we're missing that rite of passage, even in the context of this time of alienation or estrangement from ourselves as African people, that we need a rites of passage more now than ever before. Talk about what does this mean for have this rites of passage, and I would submit that even the work that you did at Hampton, the work that you continue to do, the work that you did with Bob Asa and Dr. Joyce King, this work is still a part of a rite of passage, right? It's informing you of your manhood, your functionality, your purpose in life. But let's share that. what is it about a rites of passage that that you say that we need now more than ever before?
Well, it's a deeply structured and systematic way to ensure that we pass on the best of what we know to young people. Baba Asa used to speak of intergenerational cultural transmission. Intergenerational cultural transmission is simply passing on the best of what we know to young people. But it's difficult to do that because we're dealing with many weapons of mass deception and many weapons of mass distraction. So the rites of passage is where, in traditional African societies, boys were separated from the village, girls were separated from the village. They left as a boy, they returned as a man. They left as a girl, they returned as a woman. When they were separated from the village, they were taken through trials and challenges. They were taught certain sacred information about their culture and their people. And an obligation was placed upon them. And of course, an obligation is a duty that one must live up to without question. And so, having gone through this very deep and intense training, it ensured that when that boy returned to the village as a man, he came back to help protect and provide for the village and to carry on the best traditions of that culture. When the girl returned as a woman, she came back to protect and provide for that village and to carry on the best of the culture. Today, we don't have, in many places and spaces, we don't have those traditional African rites of passage to ensure that our children will carry on the best of our cultural traditions or protect and provide for their community. Now, it becomes a rite of passage in many places for our children to get drunk. Now it becomes a rite of passage for our children to get high. Now it becomes a rite of passage for our children to have illicit and indiscriminate sex as much as they want with whomever they want, without consequence or commitment. And so, in a Eurocentric society that has suppressed Afrocentric thought, that decenters us and dislocates us from the best of our culture, this is the result of what happens. And this is why we must be very intentional about creating safe, sacred, and sovereign spaces where we can have these conversations and produce traditional African rites of passage so that we can reproduce the best of our culture. And if we have time, I want to actually share one of the online platforms that we've developed to aid in that process.
So we indeed have time for that. I wanted to just capture this conversation about weapons of mass distraction, and that the information system that we live in, the idea of within form, shape, Asian process of shaping the insides, we have content that is alien to our African existence, and so they become weapons of mass distraction. And then we don't know who we are in rites of passage. Then is something that really informs us of identity, our purpose, and our directions. Dr. Karinga talks about who we are, why we are, and what we are to do while we are here. And so this is so important to be informed about your power and your potential and your prowess. These things are missed out on when we begin to learn about the alien or the external or the European or the others as having this great power that they can talk about and fight for their sovereignty from the British, or they can say that God gave them the land, manifest destiny, or they can talk about give me liberty, give me death. But when it comes to people of African descent saying the same things, that this is out of order, as we deal with in the United States, the trial of Ahmaud Arbery, the McDonald's, or we deal with what's happening in Kenosha, the notion of Rittenhouse having these being human at the same time as the Africans are seen as inhuman or inhumane, or non-human entities, that he's called a person and he can cry on the stand, but they Africans have to be called looters and rioters and arsonists. So this idea of those who tell the narrative can begin to inform the people, but a rite of passage gives you this notion of who you are, why you are, and what you are, and allows you to be inoculated from the alien injection or the alien infusion or the alien, what Dr. Ane calls the Urugu virus. You've been inoculated from the virus of estrangement from self, because you say that even though this is what you say, I know this is who I am. My youngest daughter had an experience, Dr. Chike, and I never told you that's the story. I think that you'd appreciate this one, is that she was in middle school, began middle to middle school somewhere. I think it was the sixth grade. That's where she was, right? And so she was in the school system, and she got this lesson that says that the pyramids no, of course that's misnamed, but the pyramids in Egypt were built by aliens. And she texted me that, and she said, "LOL," right? And then about a week later, she said, "Daddy, Adolf Hitler did not go into Africa to take anything because there was nothing of value to take." LOL. And then it was a third thing that said that she said probably about a week or two later, Daddy, slavery was a benefit to the savage African. LOL. Now the question became not necessarily the content of indoctrination, right? Just a few years ago in Florida, the real challenge, the real issue was, how could this child text LOL, laugh out loud, like that? This was so absurd. It was because she had been exposed to content that you had written, had been exposed to the scholars that you've mentioned, been exposed to the teachings within the household, that she could be inoculated from that foolishness and say, this is out of order. This doesn't make any sense. This is not truthful content. And so it is a joke to hear this. But how many of her colleagues, her cohorts, didn't have an inoculant within them? Well, so the virus would take over. And so you speak to this. So go ahead.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that, because this idea of being inoculated from the Urugu virus is so very important. I want to encourage everyone to go to readingrevolution.org, readingrevolution.org, because this is our way of helping to inoculate our people. I was taught that you can't come with that you have to not just talk about the problems, you have to talk about solutions. And if we only talk about problems and don't talk about solutions, then the problem persists, because we can't expect others to solve the problems that only we ourselves can solve. So if I was to use the words of Karengi, he said, you cannot bring a critique without bringing a corrective. You cannot talk about a problem without having a solution. So if you go to readingrevolution.org, there is a solution. And if it's possible, I'd like to share my screen and actually walk people through one of the things that we've created to deal with this. Would that be okay?
Yes, sir. Please share.
Okay. So let's see here. Bear with me for just a moment. When we created Reading Revolution, it was first a book. It was a book of 90 brief reading selections about ancient African and modern African American heroes and sheroes. So African and African American heroes and sheroes. A brief reading selection with 10 multiple choice questions for each. But over the past 2 years, my family and I have digitized this content. Okay. Can you see my screen right now?
No, I'm
Dr.
not.
Washington, can you see my screen right now as I'm scrolling?
Try to do this. I've added you, so now your screen is showing.
Okay. So you can see at the top of the page, it says books are worth their weight in gold. You can see that, right?
Yes.
Okay. And just off the top of your head, real quick, if books are worth their weight in gold, tell me a book that transformed your life. Just any book, real quick.
The Miseducation of the Negro.
Miseducation of the Negro by Carter G. Woodson, certainly a classic. So this is our centering thought. We want to give an African proverb or quote to our young people and get them to think about that, right? Then we have our Baobab vocabulary. We know in African tradition, the Baobab tree is the tree of life. because the people of the village use the resources from the tree to provide for their everyday needs. We call this Baobab vocabulary because these are the words that the student will encounter in the reading selection, and studying these activities will bring life to their comprehension, to their critical thinking skills, okay? We have a reading selection about Ahmed Baba and the University of Sankore, but we also have a captioned video that I would like to show. As you can see, it's just under 3 minutes, but I would like to show this, and I'm gonna click play to make sure that you can hear it. Hold on. Ahmed Baba and the University of Sankore. Were you able to hear that?
I can hear it.
Wonderful. All right, so I'm gonna play this, and I want the listeners to listen very carefully. Now, bear in mind, this is one of 90 captioned videos and brief reading selections that we feel our children need to know and to have. So here we go. Ahmed Baba and the University of Sankore. From the 1300s to the 1700s, Timbuktu was one of the greatest cities in all of Africa. Situated near the Niger River, this great center of learning was known throughout the land. It was also an important trading center for gold, salt, iron, and books. Timbuktu had quite a reputation for educational excellence and wealth, so much so that students and scholars came from all over Africa, Asia, and Europe to study at the famed University of Sankore. Being near the river gave people easy access to this thriving city of trade and education and attracted many people. Ahmed Baba was the president of the University of Sankore for 30 years. During this time, he upheld the African standard of excellence, running the university with great vision. Also during this time, he authored 42 books. This means he wrote more than one book per year, in addition to his duties as president. Additionally, Ahmed Baba had over 1,600 books that he owned in his personal library. This shows that he knew the power of books to transform the mind. To Africans who introduced the art of writing to the world, books were sacred and holy. Books were valued so much that people paid for books using only gold. The book a person desired to purchase would be placed on one side of a scale, and gold dust would be sprinkled on the other side of the scale until the scales were balanced. Books in Timbuktu and in the empires of Mali and Songhai were literally worth their weight in gold. Because of this, the book industry was just as lucrative as the gold, salt, and iron industries. People who studied at Timbuktu learned law, medicine, and healing, writing and literature, astronomy, the study of the stars, and agriculture, the study of farming, and much more. They took their knowledge and understanding of what they learned back to other parts of Africa, Asia, and Europe. Some even came to America. History also shows us that virtually every home in Timbuktu had an extensive library of books and manuscripts. Okay, brother, so that's an example of just one of the 90 captioned videos that we have. But you have the written text here. And is there anything that stood out in that video to you, Dr. Washington?
Bob, there was quite a bit that stood out, right? The idea of the authoritative utterance in book writing, right? The knowledge of our people, how the imagery is presented so that we can not only hear a word, but we can see what it looks like. So it was engaging at the same time as it was informative.
And I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, we had a saying, man, I'll knock you all the way to Timbuktu. I didn't know that was an actual place. I didn't know that was one of the great learning centers of the world. I didn't know about Ahmed Baba and the fact that he was the president for 30 years of the University of South Korea, that he had authored 42 books, or that books were literally worth their weight in gold because you had to use gold dust to purchase the book. So many rich so much rich cultural knowledge and information in that selection. And there are 90 of these at readingrevolution.org. So for those that are watching right now, if you go there, you can do the demo and be exposed to several of them. And then if you want to look at purchasing the whole thing, that's up to you. But I'm sharing this because I want those that are watching to know that we have resources to fill these gaps that we've been talking about. When you scroll down, then you have a vocabulary activity where you can see the vocabulary words on the left-hand side, the definitions on the right-hand side, and then the student has to click and drag the word next to its definition. So, for example, we know that agriculture is the study of farming, so we would click and drag that together over there. We know the word sacred means holy. Usually the definition is not right next to the word. The student would have to click and drag it next to it, right? We know that the word lucrative means profitable, right? So the student, after doing that, can then click below and the system will score that for them, okay? But then in addition to that, you have a comprehension test that goes with each of these reading selections. And so I'll click on that so that you can see that real quick as well, because I want to walk people through this so that they can know that we have the resources necessary to turn around the miseducation. So if you look at these, and I'm going to run through these real quick, and I'm going to get some of them wrong intentionally so that you can see how the system scores it. So we know the word situated in this case means located in the reading selection, but I'm going to put educated so you can see how it will score that, okay? I'm going to run through these so that you can see, and again, I'm going to get some of them incorrect, okay? But this has become a tremendous resource for parents, for teachers, and for students themselves, okay? We want people to know that we're not just critiquing the system. We don't just have a critique, we have a corrective, right? So now as we go to this last one, let's take a look and we'll submit quiz. So I intentionally got that first one incorrect so that you can see how the system scores that. So a teacher and a student can go through that entire process and they will know what they got incorrect and what they got correct. In addition to the vocabulary activity and that comprehension quest activity, we have a grammar review. The grammar review takes content from the reading selection, and the student has to rewrite the sentence, adding capitalization, punctuation, and changing verb tense where necessary. Now, we don't have time for me to do all that, but I'm just going to put that in. I'm going to get a 0 on this because I didn't type everything in. But again, I want you to just see how the system scores that. And so after the vocabulary activity, after the comprehension activity, and after the grammar activity, if we have a reading revolution, then we also need to have a writing revolution. So each of the reading selections and videos has a writing prompt. This one says, Ahmed Baba wrote 42 books. If you were going to write a book, what would it be about? Who would it be, fiction or nonfiction? Who would the book be for? What age range or audience? Describe and explain. This gives the student the opportunity to type a paragraph or two responding to these questions. So what we have is a comprehensive language arts and reading curriculum here that we're now exposing to our people all over the world. And we're really excited about it because my family has been working on this for the past 2 years. I don't know if you can see this picture of my family here. My wife has done some of the voiceovers, so you won't just hear my voice, you'll hear a female voice on some of the reading selections. My sons did the audio engineering and the videos. My son's girlfriend helped with the video editing, and my niece helped with some of the voiceovers and the editing as well. So we are very excited about presenting this as an opportunity for our people to use all over the world to recenter ourselves in the best of our culture, to examine and analyze information, meet needs, and solve problems. So I would like to know what your thoughts are on what you saw, Dr. Washington, and as well as the viewers, if some of their comments can come through, because we are very intent on making sure that our people have access to this information. Right now, there are 90 of these captioned videos and reading selections, but ultimately, our ultimate goal, and we're working on volume 2 right now, the next 90, the goal is to have 360 altogether. And the reason we said 360 is because our ancestors taught us that there's 360 degrees of knowledge. So we feel that if our children can be exposed to 360 reading selections and caption videos and activities like that, that they will have a firm foundation to know who they are, whose they are, where they come from, and where they're going. And this is what Afrocentric or African-centered education is all about. It's about teaching our children who they are, where they come from, and what we must do. So I want to thank Dr. Kevin Washington for having me on today. It's definitely been an honor and a privilege. I want to encourage our listeners to go to readingrevolution.org and check out some of the other, the demo, so that you can expose yourself and your family to this information. If you want additional information, you can also go on to YouTube and type in my name. There are a number of different videos and video clips of me sharing information about African-centered education. So, Madasi, Asante Sana, thank you so much, Dr. Washington, for having me on today. Peace and blessings, everyone.
Baba, thank you for that information.
Oh, thank you for having me on. I appreciate this. So you said this broadcast internationally, but it's coming out of Kenya? Are you there?